Welcome to our presentation, Manual for the Future City and Time Machines, authored by Nicola Crowson and Tina Wallbridge, both academics at Portsmouth School of Architecture, Portsmouth, UK. Nicola and Tina run a master's studio entitled Future Architectures. This studio explores the making and materiality of spatial practice.
Out of chaos comes a dancing star.
Our interests combine and come through as the themes of narrative, mapping and making.
Starting with the question, what is your commitment to the future? The studio considers architecture has agency to fulfil these promises made by soon-to-be architects. We can simply describe our aims as 5 distinct things: to debate global issues and local heroes, to reveal tangible and intangible aspects of place. 2, explore how utopian and dystopian narratives in film, architecture, literature and history can be both context and catalyst for future architectures. 3, enact spatial practices and material explorations through making. 4, to create a manual for the city to enact promises for the future. 5, reflect on the studio pedagogy used within future architectures.
All of our students are studying at master's level, and we run a vertical studio with Masters 1 and Masters 2, and also part-time and also apprenticeship students. This adds for a very rich mix of students' abilities and interests. Their values and their identity is very, very important, and us nurturing an authenticity in their voice is critical. These alternative and visionary scenarios may be perfectly unrealistic or even provocative.
Working locally, thinking globally, and referring to a series of local heroes, the studio works through action, writing, drawing, debating, experimenting and making.
Portsmouth, UK is on the south coast of the United Kingdom, and Portsmouth itself sits as the only island city in the UK.
Located at the Portsmouth School of Architecture, the group quickly established that Portsmouth had a younger sibling, Gosport. Diving into Gosport's history, we discovered the Bishop of Winchester, Henry de Bois, 1153, had issued Gosport the title of God's Port. In contrast, the deeper we dug, the darker Gosport's history became. Gosport was a town plagued by the fragments of war. During the Elizabethan era, 1558 to 1603, sailors were commonly press-ganged into joining the British Navy due to heavy personal shortages. Drunkards would stumble out of their local tavern, only to wake up the next morning on board a naval ship heading to war. During World War II, Gosport had an extensive trench system, a system intended to give as much preparation to soldiers as possible, replicating the landscape in the northern regions of France, a landscape in which millions would lose their lives. The Royal Haslar Hospital, described as being reminiscent to that of a prison, began operating in 1753 and served in both world wars, treating those returning from the front lines. In summary, Gosport's unique title as God's Port, coupled with his extremely dark dystopic past and status as Portsmouth's underfunded younger sibling, made it the model location to plan our manual for the future. The Palmerston forts form a constellation of defences around the island city, encircling the harbour. These defensive star forts are global and can be seen as a motif, a micro-world, an ideal city. Thus, forts past, present and future can be viewed as time machines in themselves.
We cultivate the fort as a shell or armature in which to grow ideas born of a letter to the future, much as a pearl is induced to grow in a shell.
We consider the studio as a forum to discuss and debate matters for concern and explore architectural agency. The letters to the future form a collection of visual letters. Letters raise a huge range of ideas and concerns, dreams and promises at an extraordinary, unprecedented time. Rediscovering the lost art of letter writing was re-established through looking at Reverend Gilbert White, whose letter writing comprised his Natural History and Antiquities of Selborne. Thinking ahead to the manual that we're going to make, if we add time, a temporal axis, as part of the construct, it forms a way to address possible futures and form a more dynamic response. We considered different time frames and scales and how this may inform our architectural agency.
And here's a quote: "Without the utopians of the other times, men would still live in caves, miserable and naked. It was the utopians who traced the lines of the first city. Out of generous dreams came beneficial realities. Utopia is the principle of all progress and the essay into a better future." By Anatole France. Through the ages, the notions of dystopian futures have been varyingly narrated and grimly shaped by the era's contemporary problems. As an example, dystopian films seem to engage the audience by presenting a perfect society at the beginning. However, this perception slowly fades as the story unfolds. The analysis of utopian and dystopian precedents lead to the identification of common themes within cities. For example, during the Industrial Revolution, health was poor. Therefore, the Garden City Utopia was created to prioritise healthy ideals.
The global pandemic has meant that this master's cohort has experienced a world that is online, offline, isolating, frightening and challenging. A studio in which we are challenged to make together and consider what the future can be and how we can catalyse change in a time of climate change catastrophe projections. The studio debated the linkages between the pandemic and human overlapping and destruction of non-human ecologies. And I quote here from Florence Franklin, one of our students, who said, "In my eyes, we can only honestly commit to two things. One, to continue to reflect on where we are, and two, to do the next right thing." Our first matter of concern was about the global issue, the future. We related this to science fiction, and as our local hero, we took H.G. Wells, 1866 to 1945, who lived in Portsmouth and a park house just up the road. And I quote from his book, from chapter 1, The Eve of the War. "And before we judge them, the Martians, too harshly, we must remember what ruthless and utter destruction our own species has wrought, not only upon animals, such as the vanished bison and the dodo, but upon its own inferior races. The Tasmanians, in spite of their human likeness, were entirely swept out of existence in a war of extermination waged by European immigrants in the space of 50 years. Are we such apostles of mercy as to complain if the Martians warred in the same spirit? The irony, of course, being that the Martian invaders eventually succumbed to a terrestrial virus or bacteria."
The second matter from concern was climate crisis. Being a coastal location, this is more prevalent than you would think, with sea level rise being within the next 50 years having a real impact to the landscape of all the settlements along the southern edge of the United Kingdom. And our local hero for this was our own professor at the School of Architecture, Professor Alexandro Mellis, who talked about this environmental change. And I'd like to read from a quote. "Environmental change stimulates the manifestation of creative thinking. Creativity is an alternative survival mechanism to that of linear thinking. Creativity becomes essential in conditions of crisis, when eventually changes are so fast and extreme that they require a more radical survival manifestation, a coexistence with other species. Stone fortresses do not protect us from greenhouse gases."
In relation to these matters, we were fond of the forts and viewed our next hero, our local hero, as the forts themselves. Fort microworlds, similar to Ladue, Saltaire, Ideal City, form an arena to dream, envision and plan compact self-sustainable urban forms with mixed functions, They are a form of global architectural pattern.
Architectural agency and finding identity was another matter of concern for us as a studio, one where we allowed a student's voice to emerge as they tried to read and understand and navigate cultural identity in place and how their design within architecture, or the realm of architecture, can inform their own working practice. And we looked at Grayson Perry and his map of days and this idea of how you might represent culture.
Our final matter of concern was that of ecology and its close relationship to the COVID-19 crisis that we were all experiencing globally. You can destroy an ecology, but you cannot make or create one. You can merely give it the circumstances and opportunity to grow. Our local hero for this was very handily Gilbert White, who just up the road from Portsmouth in Selborne, Hampshire. Gilbert White was a correspondent with Charles Darwin and is considered the first ecologist. He was part of the first Age of Enlightenment, and we would like to imagine a second.
Panacea, a manual for the future, to be used by national and local governments in a bid to build towards a utopian vision and society following a catalytic dystopian year of 2021.
The Manual for the Future comprises 9 separate volumes, each dealing with different aspects of society. Volume 1, Creating a Diverse Community in a Corrupt Society to Preserve Humanity. Volume 2, To Aid Gosport's Identity Rebrand by Enhancing the Historic Narrative of Gosport. Volume 3, How to Deal with the Incoming Threat of Water in Our Urban Environments and the Effects on Nature. Volume 4, Using Recrafting as a Tool to Re-establish the Symbiotic Relationship between People and Their Social, Economic and Environmental Needs. Volume 5, Exploring the Interdependent Relationship between Humans and Nature. Volume 6, Creating Agricultural Hubs to Reduce Food Waste and Contamination in Cities of the Future to help them become self-sufficient in producing food. Volume 7, How to Provide the Community with Green Space without producing negative effects on dwelling. Volume 8, How to Ensure Connection in a Physically Divided Environment. Volume 9, Social Reset, Providing an Unconventional Alternative to Society that vastly improves the equilibrium by locking mankind away. From reading the 8 core values, you should have selected the areas that are most common to your town or cities. Upon selection, you could look at the individual hierarchy of values diagrams. These show how each volume will target different values. Choose a volume that you believe will have a positive effect on your area. On the next page, there is a strategy identifier. This will further help you decide on the volume best for you by looking into the 3 values that require the most attention.
Pour yourself into the future. You're the beginning, the middle and the end. Draw and write, you'll be overwhelmed but enlarged. Make architecture rare, make it breathtaking, make it up.
Promise 1, as we've just heard, is made by Rachel Butt and design of her healing stations. In looking at how she relates to the topics of concern or the matters of concern in the studio, in terms of ecology and COVID, she's looking at a society that's broken post this significant event. In terms of science fiction, she's looking at an imaginary society, making a new utopian society for 2100 that listens. Climate crisis, she's in charge of volume 8, How to Ensure Connection in a Physically Divided Environment. In terms of architectural agency and finding identity, she's proposing a listening society with an individual as the focus. In terms of our thoughts, she's using a metabolist approach to community within one of the thoughts.
The utopian vision builds a strong individual society that has broken from the collapsed civilization, thus forming islands like an archipelago within God's harbour. The design of a healing station was a project of complete joy and desire and ambition for a brighter future. Assuming that society is sick and needs healing, she looked back at Frank Lloyd Wright's ideas on new society, ways of preserving, improving social qualities, and how architecture can inform that.
As such, Rachel's developing architectural identity is expressed through her drawings, this web and entanglement of this new society, this utopian society, where everyone is heard and where the principle is to be listened to.
I hope there comes a positive future out of the situation that we face in our lives today, positivity that you contribute to. You may not have endless riches or your name on the tallest skyscraper, but benefit society and you will gain recognition.
Jack's promise relates to the ideas about the manifestation of water. Again, a utopian vision. It comes from this idea of how you deal with the ongoing threat of flooding and how you might protect infrastructure and society and also consider the natural environments around it. He used again an imaginary future and the idea of living above water to relate to ideas of science fiction. His focus on climate crisis related to volume 3 of the manual, where he became very interested in water management and how you can deal with and in fact utilise the idea of the threat of water. In terms of finding identity and architectural agency, he worked with the idea of living on and rising above the water.
Reclaiming land lost to water and evolving the new edges of the land. Structures can change over time and become ruins that can be occupied by new ecologies and new landscapes. The grid, developed as a tartan grid, allows the structure flexibility, and the mapping and defining the edge soft and hard make a series of exquisite drawings that map and evoke the idea of water. Jack is currently developing this attitude, how a grid can change and make joyous spaces and deal with water level rise in a very positive way.
From these truths, it leaves architects with a clear conscientious path to deliver a future that avoids the worst and nurtures the best, all the while being sure to embed these virtues into the presence of the proposal should it endure beyond our scope of imagining.
Our final student is our cosmic wanderer. He has a utopian vision of a launch pad for the future, and he is interested in the use of future materials. He looks to space exploration to help and support ideas of technological advances and predictions of the future. And in relation to forts, he works beyond God's Harbour, on the Isle of Wight, where there is an existing fort.
The Cosmic Wanderer itself is conceived as an object at various scales. What could the ark comprise? How do we talk about the best of ourselves, is the question he's looking to answer. The only space station in the UK is on the Isle of Wight, on the very corner by the Needles. It used to be the site for the Black Arrow programme, but is now reimagining it as a place where we can once more launch ourselves into the sky.
From architecture to exhibition.
You can see the benefits of debating these matters of concern with the students, the cathartic nature of designing utopias to answer the problems these young people are encountering in their lives so early on.
We've managed to reveal a connection of scales from global to local, which has very much supported our group in using their narratives. We've seen representation of how their authentic voice has been supported and how we've helped nurture them to share their commitment to the future. And regardless of limitations to our physical making, we've worked very well in the digital realm. We have managed to propose a manual for the future and test it on a location, and by structuring it into individual volumes, it's allowed a kind of temporal dimension to allow these range of future scenarios to be considered. There's a massive power in the use of the letter and drawings to act as a framework of sharing and community ideas, and it is possible to co-draw and co-make and design in these isolated times. We'd like to thank you all very, very much for your time, and also acknowledge all those students and critical friends that have been with us on this journey.